Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Contemporary Issues class. We are going to have a good presentation today about Latin America.
I hope so.
By Eric Schmidt, our class member and high school teacher and frequent traveler to Latin America. And we have other folks here who've been to Guatemala recently and served in the Peace Corps there. So we have lots of interest. And of course, we've talked about immigration recently in this class, an ongoing issue. So Latin America applies to all of that too. But before we start our usual announcements, Zoomers, please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen when you are not speaking. And I assume Eric would like our comments and discussion as we go along today. Any questions? Raise hand for a question.
If it's a short question,
But just short
because I have a lot of slides.
questions and comments short. And we are recording this for future playback. And we're going to keep our announcements very brief today. Anyone going to watch the Academy Awards tonight, the Oscar shows? Vicky loves to see what the ladies are wearing.
Yes.
Yes.
He likes to blame it on me.
I like to see what the ladies are wearing.
I want to see Oppenheimer.
Or not.
And whether Oppenheimer will win the best picture. That's right. Yes, that's right. And lots of things in the news going on, Trump and Biden in their face-off. But we will talk about that another day as we get closer to that election. Ron and I will cover elections as we go on through the year. Okay, with that, let me introduce Eric, who's been in our class a couple years and high school teaching. What's your specialty at high school?
I taught earth science and marine biology for
Okay.
15 years.
But he sponsors several young people in Latin America through Compassion International, and you've been to every country there probably, haven't you?
Every country but Belize.
Belize.
It's the only one I haven't been to.
Okay, very good. So let's hear a little bit about how America was involved in Latin America and the good and bad things our country did there, and kind of setting the stage for the current situation there also. So thank you, Eric, for presenting.
And I haven't been to Haiti, although it's kind of, right now, it's kind of a failed state.
Yes.
Yeah, not a place I would want to go. I discovered this book in an AP history class at Dakota Ridge High School when I was substituting there. And it's a graduate level book, and it's difficult. No, I didn't swipe it. I bought my own copy.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Lori.
Okay, now you can finish the presentation.
Now I can finish. It was good to have a background in kind of what our country's been doing since the Second World War. And that began for me with the history of the CIA. It's called Legacy of Ashes. I talked about this last year when I presented on Nicaragua. But these two books really helped me understand, and a couple others, when I was getting started on this. So here we go.
Okay, we'll go to share your screen. First slide. Okay.
I really felt like it was important to present just a couple slides on the background of Latin America. So my title is How the USA, the Soviet Union, and Cuba, in conjunction with leftists and right-wing military response, affected the social, economic, political, and military life in Central and South America after World War II. So even that subtitle, you can tell that this is a very broad topic. Columbus was really the collision between two hemispheres. When he came in 1492, he initiated Spain's quest for a shorter trade route to India and the Spice Islands, resulting in the conquest, colonization, Christian conversion, and enslavement and or death of indigenous people in what is now Central and South America.
It wasn't only America, he was South America.
Right. Well, that was the end result. The post-revolution period, 1821, 1828, revolution from Spain, in Latin America was an economic system that delivered wealth and power to a small elite, a social system designed to maintain class boundaries and ensure a steady labor supply, producing cycles of repression and revolt in many parts of Latin America, giving the region a built-in instability after their revolution from Spain. So Latin America, a loose definition. Independence from Spain in northern South America, achieved in 1821, was led by Simón Bolívar in the northern part of South America, and in the southern part, José de San Martín, who chased out the last Spaniards in the south in 1826. Bolívar warned that South America, I didn't bring his book today but I read his biography, warned that South America was not ready for democracy, and he advocated for a strong central government, a Gran Colombia that included Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, named for him. Bolivar prophetically concluded, I love this, America is ungovernable. Governable. He who serves a revolution plows the sea. The country is bound to fall into unimaginable chaos, after which it will pass into the hands of an undistinguishable string of tyrants. That was a prophecy that came true. Yes. The Monroe Doctrine happened about at the same time of the revolution from Spain in 1823, warned European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, because U.S. leaders viewed American hegemony as in the Western Hemisphere as integral to their national security. So that started 200 years ago, the Monroe Doctrine. So this is our background in which this things takes place. Yep, next. And for anybody that wants to view this PowerPoint later on, this kind of helped me try and organize these decades, because he really presents what happens in terms of decades. What made it difficult to read is he jumps around. He jumps back and forth. So I had to keep modifying and editing and doing all those other things. So we'll start with after World War II and the 1950s. That's when things really got going with Eisenhower. FDR initiated the good neighbor policy. Anti-imperialism became prominent in the 1920s and 30s in Latin America, which was influenced by Marxist theories and U.S. influence in Latin America. The good neighbor policy came from FDR, encouraged U.S. corporations to contribute to the economic well-being of their host countries, which also produced a willingness by FDR to rely on friendly dictators, unfortunately, like Somoza in Nicaragua and Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. The Organization of American States in the late 1940s institutionalized American hegemony in the hemisphere.
Like you said, we propped up friendly dictators to
Yep.
protect U.S. interests.
U.S. hegemony, yeah, and interests, yes. Okay, so I'll start with Argentina and Perón. 1943 to 1955, General Perón staged a military coup in 1943, forging alliances with trade unions and de Camasiados, or the shirtless ones. Becoming president in 1946, he increased wages and the right to collective bargaining, so he was very popular in the beginning. Perón's government, though, was corrupt and authoritarian, yet it helped workers. There was a military coup in 1955 that ended his reign, another coup, as generals banned his party and jailed many of its pro-Perón union leaders. So the left photo, the obelisk in Buenos Aires, that's my photo. And then the Casa de Roja, or Roja de Casa, the red house, is their White House, basically, only it's red. And the picture in the middle, I had to borrow that from the internet. That's General Perón there. Next. Okay, at the same time, the same in the 50s, 1954, the Guatemalan government was overthrown. So we have some people in the back. Steve, I know, goes to Guatemala. It expanded peasant rights. Guatemala expanded peasant rights and initiated agrarian reforms that struck at the heart of landholding elite and U.S.-owned United Fruit Company. Eisenhower and CIA, Allen Dulles, the director of CIA, approved Operation Success in December 1953, cooperating with Guatemalan military dissidents to launch a campaign of lies leading to an invasion from Honduras and El Salvador with CIA air attacks. So the CIA had its own little air force that attacked and made this conversion or this overthrow of the government. It was President Arbenz, who was democratically elected. Dulles appointed Colonel Al Haney, a special deputy for Operation Success, to overthrow Guatemala's government, later sending him a list of 58 government leaders targeted for assassination. El Presidente Arbenz, who was democratically elected, fled the country. It led to 36 years of civil war, military rulers, death squad, and armed repression. Che Guevara was there in 1954, and he observed the bombing of Guatemala City by these CIA planes. So it was at that moment that he vowed, he vowed this is not going to happen again. He's going to do whatever he can for the rest of his life to fight U.S. imperialism. And that was the Legacy of Ashes, the book I'm passing around. That was my source. Okay, so a game changer. Now we got Castro's revolution. Originated in 1953 as a middle-class revolt against Presidente Batista, another one of these dictators that we supported. Che Guevara joined Castro's movement to get support from rural poor following the 1956 defeat. He was defeated initially. Castro was defeated in 56. Batista fled on New Year's Eve, 1958. The next 2 years, Fidel, Raul, and Che gained control of the new government, and an alliance with the Soviet Union was formed. Ooh, hello. Revolution was an expression of discontent with authoritarianism. Again, Batista. The mobilization of student groups and uneven economic development. So student groups from Argentina to Mexico mobilized against governments. Mexican ex-president formed the National Liberation Movement against the unholy trinity of, quote, dominant oligarchies, the political clergy, and North American imperialism. So this is already happening. This is kind of the game changer of everything else, was the Castro Revolution.
Eric, is Castro's brother still president of Cuba
Raul?
today?
I think so, but I'm not certain. I'm not,
Just curious. Yeah.
that's a good question. I'm not certain on Raul. Okay, so the immediate effects. Guerrilla uprisings were supported by Castro in Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. These revolutions produced or promoted a radicalization of the right and military mobilizations by governments that were fearful of communist takeover. So it really mobilized the militaries in these other countries. Brazil's General Silva argued citizens, quote, must abandon the secular liberties and place them in the hands of the state, the all-powerful Lord of War. That was in Brazil. So again, they're mobilizing to fight this threat. Revolutions were cast as a struggle between Cuban liberation and U.S. imperialism. And for Guevara, a mixture of Marxism and his direct experience with U.S. power in Guatemala produced antipathy to the U.S. Castro mobilized Latin America's opposition to these, quote, these miserable imperialist gringos, which found a receptive audience after U.S. intervention in Guatemala had undone the warm feeling during the good neighbor era that FDR had established. It really undid it. So I thought Eisenhower's a great general. He did great. He did good things as a president. He kept us out of nuclear war. And when I read some of his books about his presidency, he always made the point that even his wife didn't know whether he was willing to use nuclear weapons. Nobody knew, even his wife. But it was that willingness to use them that assured, what did they call it? Strategic assured destruction.
Mutual.
Mutual assured destruction. Yeah, that's what made it work. Okay, so Bay of Pigs, multilateral coalition in 1960-61 led by the CIA prepared an operation meant to ignite civil war in Cuba and destroy Castro's regime. April 17th, 1961, a force of 1,200 Cuban exiles went ashore at the Bay of Pigs, resulting in disaster as invaders were trapped and Kennedy abandoned the invaders to their fate, which was death or capture. Soviet-Cuban alliance was strengthened as a result, and Moscow's presence in Latin America has increased. Soviet arms shipments sent more fighter planes and air defenses. I didn't say it here, but eventually then they also shipped nuclear weapons, launchers. And Americanism intensified following Guatemala and the Bay of Pigs. So things are really getting going now in terms of anger with the US. Moscow and Havana's strategy. The approach to Latin America was two-pronged. Cuba's defenses were built up against external attack, programs to destabilize existing governments and aid insurgent movements. Rivera composed his lessons of war into the quote focus point or center in a book that he wrote called Guerrilla Warfare. Che argued that the Cuban revolt represented a quote change in the old dogmas concerning the conduct of the popular masses of Latin America. Che's FOCO theory was not suited to the cultural and political context of most countries, so he really kind of failed. And in conjunction with the decline of the Soviet-Cuban influence during the mid-1960s, ultimately led to disaster for regional guerrilla movements. So he got things going, but in most cases, he was not able to mobilize the masses like he wanted to. Cubans view themselves as liberators destined to helping exploited nations of Latin America break free from imperial domination, and their interventions also took place in some African nations. I think Angola was one of them. Next. Okay, here's Kennedy's response. Kennedy came up with this modernization theory, which helped create the Peace Corps, Strategic Hamlet Program in Vietnam, and Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was a product of Kennedy's preoccupation with anti-Americanism during the Eisenhower years. Kennedy said, "You remember those," I can't see that. Yeah, you remember those. Can you move your mouse?
Oh, sorry, sorry.
Thanks. You remember those people who threw rocks at Nixon, Kennedy remarked. I'd like to believe it was just Nixon's personality, but they were sending us a message. That was Kennedy. So the alliance created in 1961 to satisfy, quote, the basic needs of the Latin American people for homes, work, and land, health, and schools. It was a 10-year program to aid committed Latin American leaders in stimulating economic growth and better distributing its wealth. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said the point was to help Latin American countries escape their agrarian, semi-feudal economic structure and thrust them toward Western-style industrialization. Next. Okay, national security doctrine. This was the response of South American countries. It was a set of ideas that dominated Latin American military politics, inspiring coups and assertive military regimes. Guerrilla violence and the internal turmoil provoked an assertive anti-revolutionary military response. Ultimately, it led to the Dirty Wars, which I'll talk about later. Liberation theology. Okay, here's our religious connection. Arose primarily in rural areas of Central America in, I think that word's response, to crushing poverty and exclusion. In response, death squads targeted religious communities and priests in Guatemala and El Salvador. Our Catholic Bishop Oscar Romero was assassinated in March 24th, 1980, and I bought his book. It's one of the only English translations I could find. And it's stories, memories and mosaics, stories of Archbishop Romero. I visited some of the places where he preached and where he was assassinated also. If I have time, I'll tell you more. I'll tell you a couple of his stories.
Eric, what does liberation theology mean?
It really is that people believe that Christianity is more than just salvation, a pie in the sky when you die.
Mhm.
It's living it out and helping the poor. That's really what it comes down to. Is helping the poor and living out your faith and not allowing governments to manhandle or run roughshod over the local people, the rural, the campesinos. Yeah.
Stay liberated from domination.
Yeah.
And that's our theology, part of our theology.
Yeah, by the military and social elites.
Okay.
So like in El Salvador, the people that run the country are they call them the 13 families, because they're the ones in control. But there is hope now in El Salvador. I've got a friend down there right now that went out last night to the city center at night, to the city cathedral, because they feel so much safer now with their current president. Bukele, he's not left and he's not right, he's right in the center. He rounded up all these gang members. The criticism from our country, of course, is that he sidelined the Supreme Court, and a lot of these people were arrested without due process. So like 76,000 people were in prison, and a good probably 10% of them, maybe more, are innocent. You know, they don't have cause to arrest them, but they rounded them up, a lot of them without due process, and so that's the criticism. But they're much happier there now. It's like they're willing to accept those, the cost, I guess you might say. It's much safer right now in El Salvador.
The moms aren't quite so happy about it, of the young men who
True.
are not involved in the
True.
games.
But some of the moms, even with a son, you probably saw the same interview I do, even with a son in custody that was unjustly kept, she's even happy with him. Because you probably saw the same interview I
So
did.
these are like good dictators.
Yes, yeah.
Good for the country. They're authoritarian dictators, but they're doing a good job.
So the military juntas came to power in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama, Peru. This is like a laundry list of countries. Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, Dominican Republic, because civilian control of the military has always been weak. That's one of the reasons why these military juntas came to power. The national security doctrine, again, that's the South America's response to the communist threat. With Latin American government response to leftist violence. NSD identified Marxism as, quote, foreign and threatening. Whereas liberation theology considered Marxist ideas relevant to the everyday struggle for dignity and survival. Military juntas in Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile produced dirty wars, that's what they called them, against leftist guerrilla violence. This is where people disappeared in the night. People who were considered leftists or guerrillas would just disappear. They'd come and get them. In Argentina, when I visited there and talked and then visited friends in Uruguay, they said people were pushed out of planes. They just, mothers are still today trying to find out what happened to their husbands and sons during that period. But again, that was the response to the Cuban Revolution and the fear of communism. Long-term effects. Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 was the closest Latin America's Cold War came to touching off a nuclear conflagration. You all know that. It was resolved October 27, 1962, when Bobby Kennedy met with the Soviet ambassador, accepting a quid pro quo, removing medium-range missiles from Turkey, as Soviet missiles in Cuba were also withdrawn, provided the deal was kept secret. So back during that period, everybody thought, hey, Kennedy, he's got those missiles out of Cuba. What they didn't know back then was we took our missiles out of Turkey at the same time. So it was a quid pro quo. And again, that's Legacy of Ashes is my source. Missile crisis crippled the Soviet Cuban aims in Latin America, along with Castro's use of the death penalty and limiting civil political liberties. So the missile crisis actually led to kind of the death knell of Soviet-Cuban relations in many ways. Economic underperformance. This was the other part that caused failure. Castro's program failed badly as agricultural output fell and poor management and shortages of spare parts ended his industrialization experiment. By 1970, Cuba completely reliant on Soviet aid.
Esther, did you have a quick question or comment?
Oh.
I'm sorry, my wife said you did.
I did not.
That's what I heard.
I'm sorry, I was talking about a friend of mine whose name is Esther,
Oh,
who had the fear that her husband, who was in politics in Argentina, would be taken in the night.
oh, yeah.
That's what I.
I'm sorry,
said.
another
Wrong
Esther.
Esther. But it was a real fear
Oh, sure.
of hers. She wasn't sure he was, yeah.
Wasn't sure to make it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
All right.
I won't go-
We're doing well. I think we might actually get through this. Next. Yep. All right, the guerrilla movements and modernization theory, they both failed. So guerrillas were mostly urban, middle-class mestizos, which is, of course, our indigenous and Spanish mix people, who failed to attract support from the poor rural campesinos, and they failed to seize power. But their violence gave militaries and conservative elites a reason and a pretext for internal repression, which ushered in military juntas, especially in South America during the next decade. Rivera was ultimately captured and executed by the CIA in Bolivia in 1967. That was the end. Modernization theory. That was, again, the US response. Unfortunately, it was a one-size-fits-all approach that failed as it was poorly fitted to the cultural or economic setting. So it wasn't really implemented well. Didn't consider the context of the cultures. US planners had assumed that this is why it failed. They assumed that development would produce stability, but in many cases, the opposite was true, as it led to polarization and defense of the status quo. Didn't work. Next. Counterinsurgencies and intervention in the 1960s. Kennedy and Johnson pursued intervention efforts that toppled leaders or swung elections in the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Brazil, Guyana, Chile, and Costa Rica. Most of their spending was in Venezuela. It is beyond debate that US counterinsurgency programs contributed to the erosion of Central American democracy. In general, though, it was the local context rather than US aid that determined how counterinsurgency played out. So that was for me a little bit of a surprise. That it wasn't all our fault, I think is what this author is saying, Hal Brands. And by the late 1960s, US policy in Latin America became unsustainable. Next. Now we're moving into the 70s, I think. So failures in the 60s. Khrushchev, Castro, and Rivera failed to drive radical change. Khrushchev tried to spread socialism in Latin America, but methods frightened and repelled his audience. Castro's clumsy interventions ensured diplomatic isolation. Washington avoided a second Cuba, but its military interventions provoked a backlash that canceled its limited gains. Simple-minded policies driven by the ideological imperatives of US, Cuban, and Soviet systems proved incapable of transforming the large and complex region that is Latin America. So the decade that began with revolution ended in a whimper, but turmoil in the 70s was soon to be revealed in a right-wing military backlash that I've already talked about. Argentina and Uruguay. Students and unionist guerrilla leaders drawing inspiration from Vietnam, this was interesting, the connection, were strongly influenced by liberation theology in Catholic-dominated Southern Cone. They call that southern part the Southern Cone, which is Argentina, Uruguay, and, well, it's part of it's Patagonia. I visited down there. Just as Argentina people did not hesitate in expelling the Spaniard, neither will we hesitate in struggling against North American imperialism. Red One flyer. Chile joined Castro as a sponsor of this revolutionary violence, leading to bank robberies, kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations. Again, that was leftist violence. This is what provoked the military response. The military allowed Perón to return in 1973 in a bid to stem the violence, but that too failed. He was not able. Again, the government was weak. Next. The military response. This is when the dirty wars began. Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay governments were toppled by military coups between 73 and 76, producing an all-out offensive against the left. And again, the fear of communism. Violence and upheaval in the early 1970s alienated most of the public. This is violence and upheaval by the guerrillas, as trade unionists, student groups, and it accelerated the radicalization of the armed forces. So it just gave them more power. The Uruguayan military, working with death squads in 72, soon captured or killed over 1,000 guerrillas, seizing power the next year. Argentina's growth in foreign-sponsored guerrilla movements and internal turmoil, along with the impotence of the democratic system, led to drastic military countermeasures, and 25,000 to 30,000 were killed or disappeared. But as you'll see later, that number pales in comparison to what happened in Guatemala and Nicaragua and El Salvador.
Eric, was there any country that's been stable and safe throughout Latin America
Costa Rica.
in recent memory.
Costa Rica,
Costa Rica.
in 1948, they eliminated their military. They outlawed it, and they plowed the savings back into education and tourism. 1948.
And healthcare too, right?
Yes.
Yes.
It was
Healthcare, education.
Yeah, Nicas, Nicaraguans who flee Nicaragua, because they said our population is 4.5 million in Costa Rica. And 4.5 million, 1.5 million of those 4.5 million are Nicas, Nicaraguans. Which is a good deal for them, because they come to Costa Rica and pick the coffee beans. Costa Ricans won't pick the coffee beans. So the Nicas come, they pick the coffee beans, their children get a great education, and they get good health care. So it's a good deal for Nicaraguans who are fleeing from that, what is now a dictatorship.
a lot of Nicaraguans in Ecuador.
Are there?
Yeah.
Oh, and Venezuela.
And Venezuelans.
And Venezuelans. Yeah.
But yeah.
I didn't know about Ecuador.
Yeah.
They've got their own issues right now.
Right now.
Yeah. One of
They
my,
have the port for the drugs.
Mm,
That's the problem.
the coca leaves come from Bolivia, but they're refined in Colombia and Peru.
Colombia and Peru are the largest cocaine growers in the world.
Producers,
And they need
Yes.
Ecuador to transport.
but they get the leaves, the coca leaves primarily from Bolivia.
Yeah, I just came back from Ecuador
Did you?
this week.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I've got, I had a student, his mother was Ecuadorian, and I visited him in, let's see, 2014. Was the last time I was there. Also, I sponsored a kid down there through Compassion. So Uruguayan military, death squads, Argentina's growth. In 76, with inflation out of control and violence convulsing Argentina, the military took control away from Mrs. Perón. This was Juan's third wife. Because he had died in 74 anyway, they took away control from her in a long anticipated coup. Next. So Chilean military coup, this was CIA finance. This is where we toppled Allende, but we did it over a number of years. Allende unions and the press cultivating disaffected military officials after Henry Kissinger had asked Director Helms to weigh chances for a military coup. History of the CIA. Nixon later ordered a military coup without telling Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the American ambassador, or the station chief. Yeah. October 6, 1970, Kissinger and Helms met and a flash cable was sent to Santiago CIA station, quote, contact the military and let them know USG wants a military solution and that we will support them now and later. Create some sort of coup climate, sponsor a military move. Chile coup was accomplished in 9/11, 1973, and President Allende killed himself. So they put in power Pinochet, and he was just as bad or even worse. Than the previous president. So we're still trying to manufacture peace in Latin America. Nixon doctrine and Venezuela rising. Nixon announced that Washington allies would be expected to bear more of the burden of their own defense. Venezuela, Mexico, and Brazil interpreted this as an invitation to enter into the vacuum created by US entrenchment. So we're starting to back off and they're moving in because of that vacuum. Venezuela and its huge oil reserves became an important player both locally and internationally. Oil revenues used to launch aid campaigns to Central America and the Caribbean while reaching out to Cuba and Haiti. One of the things I found out in one of my 15 trips to Nicaragua is that cheap oil and gas was sold. They were the source for oil and gas in Nicaragua. Very cheap oil and gas. Chavez is still admired, and you'll see in the next slide. This is a picture I took at Christmas time. It's huge. This is like a 40-foot lit up Hugo Chavez memorabilia, I guess you call it. This is during this was at Christmas time. I went down there. So he's still widely admired. The street that this takes, the avenue is named after him. I stayed at the old Crown Plaza. It looks like a pyramid hotel. It's one of the few structures in downtown Managua that outlasted the 72 earthquake, which devastated the city center. Next. Nicaragua. Okay, this is more. This is something I know more about because I've been, like I said, 15 times down there. The Sandinista National Liberation Front rose to power in 1979. That was their revolution. In opposition to USA-sponsored Somoza. He was a dictator they wanted to get rid of. Revolution was an unavoidable outcome of socioeconomic inequality. And political exclusion is one explanation by author Hal Brands. 4 principal factors coalesced in the late 70s. The Nicaraguan system broke down, government corruption again and repression. Guerrilla strategies achieved widespread political support. Insurgents enjoyed substantial foreign aid from Cuba and other Latin nations. Carter policies emphasizing non-intervention and human rights actually helped this revolution get going. So there were really only 2, quote, revolutions in Central and South America after, of course, the initial one in 1821 against Spain. And that was Cuba and Nicaragua. All the other countries were coups, military coups, or civil wars, as you'll see in a moment. Next. This is the 72 earthquake closed the Managua Cathedral. So it sits there, an edifice that is no longer usable. It was considered unsafe. I mean, if you walk around it, you can see all the cracked foundation. So that was part of the 72 earthquake. Next. Broad opposition front formed as a coalition of anti-Somoza parties. The regime response was conservative newspaper editor Chamorro was murdered in 1978. The FSLN, which are the Sandinistas, resurgence with a decline in the rural and working class life. The triumph, these are causes. The triumph of Ho Chi Minh's People's War demonstrated the necessity of patient long-term efforts in building support among the rural poor population. So they took inspiration from Ho Chi Minh's struggle.
Was China ever trying to get involved in all these countries too?
They are there now,
Yeah.
but back
Past
then,
decades, were they there?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think the Soviet Union was more of a
Yeah.
power player in Central and South America.
Okay.
Umberto and Daniel Ortega cloaked their commitment to a Marxist-Leninist content by promising to steer, quote, towards socialism. So they call themselves a socialist republic, but it's anything but. It's really a communist country. Ortega's wife, he's made himself dictator for life. His wife is the vice president. And the locals
That's nice.
call her a bruja, which is a witch. Because if you go back to that slide of Chavez, she's built all of these trees of life. And the locals say, oh, if you look closely, you can see the 666 in those trees. So, but he's fading, his health isn't good. And of course, my prayer is that God would put in place a democratic leader eventually, because the people are wonderful. You know, they're really great people in Nicaragua. And it's the same in the other countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Okay, I think I covered the causes. Nicaragua Revolution, the 80s result. So this is when things really got going in Central America. Civil wars erupted in Guatemala and El Salvador, eventually killing 200,000 in Guatemala. They're still digging up bodies in rural areas of Guatemala. 70,000 in El Salvador. Domestic conflict, the result of brutal counterinsurgency, rural agriculture, commercialization, and the growth in liberation theology. So liberation theology, again, to answer your question, was a grassroots movement seeking spiritual and social change. The percentage of campesinos in El Salvador without land rose from 27% to 65%. So the rural people were losing their land. Guatemalan wages fell 50%. Salvadoran rural communities aligned themselves with guerrilla groups and the Catholic Church, including Archbishop Romero, who paid for it with his life because he spoke out against the government on radio and in the pulpit. In fact, one of the stories had a Christian tour guide tell me this. He says that before he was assassinated in the late 70s, he went to Congress and said, stop sending money to El Salvador because they're using the money to buy guns and ammunition to kill the people in the rural areas. So he told that spelled the end of his life, basically, when he did that. Now he was a target of the government. Internal crises produced external intervention by USA, Moscow, and Havana. Okay, here's more about Romero. His critique against the government, again, this was loud and sustained. Political power is in the hands of the unscrupulous military who only know how to repress the people and promote the interests of the Salvadoran oligarchy. Again, the 13 families. Armed forces reacted to civil unrest by rigged elections, censoring dissent while cooperating with landowners and anti-communist elements to create death squads that tormented the campesinos. Rural priests singled out for punishment. And quote, be a patriot, kill a priest was often heard in El Salvador.
Oh, gosh.
Violence escalated and Romero was assassinated in the pulpit of the chapel of the hospital for poor and indigenous people. I visited that chapel.
He was in the pulpit when
He was in the pulpit. Yep. The door was open, shot came through and killed him in the pulpit.
Wow.
And these are some pictures that I took, Romero's crypt. On the right, this is Fernando, Wilmer Fernando, one of the kids I sponsor in El Salvador. And I took him to visit this place where, this crypt where Romero was buried, which is on the right. And in the center, that's the pulpit in that chapel of the indigenous people, indigenous hospital where he was assassinated. Got some more pictures here. Also, not just Romero, but Jesuit priests, 6 Jesuit priests and their cook were murdered in this rose garden. I took that picture on the right by Salvadoran military in 1989. So this began in 1980 and extended until 1992 when peace was established in Guatemala and in El Salvador. That's when both sides laid down their weapons, so to speak.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes left.
All right, I got 7 more slides. Carter and Reagan response. The anti-FSLN, again, the Sandinistas, the Contras began training with CIA support in Honduras, the Carter administration. So it actually started in Carter's administration, not Reagan, to counter the Nicaraguan military support of the Salvadoran guerrillas, who were the FMLN. I get lost in these acronyms. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, remember him?
Oh, yeah.
He said Washington would be, quote, drawing the line on Soviet-Cuban involvement, adding, give me the word and I'll turn that effing island into a parking lot. He said of Cuba. Reagan decided something else. Reagan sent large-scale military aid and equipment to the Salvadoran armed forces and trained 29,000 new military personnel. Again, we were supporting the government, the military junta against the people at that point. U.S. military assistance was counterproductive in El Salvador, and it enabled practices that had alienated the population, including El Mazote, probably heard of that one, Steve, where hundreds of victims were raped, tortured, and massacred. That was in Guatemala. U.S. congressman said, quote, the American people knew we have been down this road before. And one bumper sticker read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. Salvadoran Civil War was a proxy war between the USA supporting military government versus the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Early 80s saw 70,000 Salvadorans killed, 80% of the total by government and death squads. Hundreds of thousands fled to the USA from El Salvador and Guatemala, setting the stage for the formation of MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang in the USA. So it really got started. These Guatemalan and Salvadoran gangs really got started in the US when the refugees fled these civil wars. In 83, Vice President George Bush traveled to San Salvador with a warning to rein in the death squads, which eventually it did. Okay, I'm almost there. Guatemalan Civil War. Military targeted not just guerrillas, but entire villages, and 400 villages disappeared. Beheading, immolations, and massacres were common. Toxic racism aided the brutality, ergo the indigenous community represented, in their minds, a lesser developed stage of humanity. Yeah, genocide was the result as 100,000 indigenous people lost their lives between 81 and 83 due to security forces and death squads. By the mid-1980s, it was clear that insurgents could not gain power And though not defeated, their influence declined as a result of their own excesses in dealing with the rural campesinos. Sandinistas and Contras stalemate. Contras were ineffective. Yes, US support was much less than Cuban and Soviet support for the Nicaraguan government, leading to a stalemate and what James Baker called, quote, our country's Vietnam of the 1980s. Nicaraguan revolution weakened by 1988 as public support declined for it. The result of Sandinista, FSLN repression, and the economy was near zero. Congressional support for the Contras evaporated with the Iran-Contra scandal. You probably remember that from the news. I remember that.
I think that was Reagan.
That was Reagan, yep. And as his second term, I believe. And as the Cold War was winding down, President Bush, 1988, was interested in removing what Secretary of State James Baker called the bleeding sore of Central America. Economic realities forced Gorbachev and the Kremlin to begin cutting back support for the FSLN, so the Sandinistas, and the FMLN, El Salvador, after 1989, as the USSR was nearing collapse. So, Contras and Sandinistas then, direct talk started in 1990. Ceasefire in Nicaragua, FSLN agreed to national elections, and Ortega was not elected. In fact, he ran for election twice, lost twice. It wasn't until the third time, which was 2005, that he was re-elected, and then made himself dictator for life. So he didn't. So after this, he actually failed in 2 re-election attempts. Decade of economic hardship, conscription, political restrictions, and Sandinista repression led Violeta Chamorro, the wife of the slain newspaper editor, to defeat Ortega by a margin of 55 to 41. Again, he didn't finally get reelected until 2005. So Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, the death toll was about 300,000 with catastrophic destruction. So again, much worse than the dirty wars in Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. 10-fold worse. Central America's civil wars dwarf South America's dirty wars in intensity and duration. Results: Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador suffered massive human and economic losses during the 1980s, as well as cultural and social traumas, leaving them with legacies of fear that persist today. Cold War authoritarianism had swept Latin America during the 60s, 70s, but the 80s marked a retreat from the dictators. Again, except for Ortega and Maduro now in Venezuela. Democratization was mostly the product of debt, as dictators failed to deal with the socioeconomic realities of their failed policies, but generals in Argentina launched the Falklands War. Remember that?
Yeah.
In hoping to regain power in 1982. Well, their hope was because they had helped us earlier in some of our Central American conflicts. They thought we would come in on their side, but we didn't. We sided with Great Britain, and that was about the time I was in the Navy, and we had a machine on the back of our ship called the CWIS, Close-In Weapon System, which was developed in response to the Falklands War, because these French Exocet missiles would launch high, they'd come down and they'd come across the water, 8 feet across the water, and sunk quite a few British ships. They're French missiles, Exocet missiles. And so this little, we called it R2D2, this little white cone-shaped device on the back of our ships now fires 3,000 rounds per minute. That's what it sounds like. And it shoots down that type of Exocet missile, which would be coming across the water and hit our ships. So it was designed by General Dynamics for specifically to counteract this Exocet style missile that sunk so many British ships during the Falklands War. The late 80s saw a rush to free market capitalism and electoral democracy, but those were no panacea for the region's problems, especially the poor. Next, a couple more slides. Democracy and the Red Scare replaced by the drug trade and immigration. So did we really win the Cold War in Central America? Polls in the 90s and 2000s revealed a loss of confidence in democracy as citizens questioned, could the new system meet basic needs? Those sentiments led to the rise of Chavez and Morales. Morales was the indigenous president in Bolivia. Both populists who promised to combat savage capitalism as they handed out large subsidies and other benefits to the poor, ultimately bankrupting Venezuela. Although the USA appeared to have won, the new system of democratic reforms did not work, as evidenced by the rise in cocoa production, illegal immigration to the USA, the rise of Chavez, and Daniel Ortega again regained control in 2005. Now he's the dictator for life. 2 more slides. Wow. Praise the Lord. Okay, USA involvement? Did I do that? Oh, yeah. No, I didn't. Widely held belief by the left in the US and Latin America is that the US military aid to Latin American regimes has been the main cause of revolutionary failures in Latin America since 1960. That's a widely held belief. The deaths of 200,000 Guatemalans, the slaughter in El Salvador and Argentina, in addition to the not so covert wars against Allende in Chile and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, lends credence to this theory. However, and this was what I learned from this book. The guerrilla wars never proved very effective in attaining or holding the popularity necessary to bring them to power. One observer wrote, neither the peasants nor the urban masses are particularly revolutionary in spite of the unspeakable conditions in which both groups live. And next. So the author's summary. Brands says, while the USA enabled state terror in various countries, the argument that the USA caused such terror is harder to sustain as Latin American elites used anti-communism as the basis for a partnership with the USA that was desperate to prevent any more red in the hemisphere. Communism. Although US involvement led to polarization and violence in Latin America, it must also be remembered that the Cuban Revolution led to involvement of Moscow, Havana, and their partners. 1980s, Nicaragua, Soviet, and Cuban aid to the FSLN alienated moderates and the anti-Somoza coalition, leading to the Contra War. And finally, the next slide. Further analysis. El Salvador's turnaround, beginning with the newest story, February 13th. Here's some links if anybody wants to look at these. This is a personal note. Jose's mother in Nicaragua, he's 23 now, teaches English in a Christian school. She said to me, I took the 2 of them to Ometepe, which is an island on Lake Nicaragua. And she said to me during those 3 days we were there, she said to me that she said, I was a Sandinista, but I'm not a Danielista. That's what she said. So she supported the revolution. She doesn't support Daniel Ortega. That's what she said. And that's it. If there's any questions, looks like we've got about 5 minutes left.
So we were trying to keep communism out of Latin America as well as our own friendly dictators in,
Oh, yeah.
but it didn't always work so well.
No, the one size fits all that Kennedy's Alliance for Progress and Modernization theory didn't work the way we wanted it to. And unfortunately, there was a history still today of trying to impose a military solution on a government that is ostensibly democratic, though influenced by communism, Moscow and Havana.
Are we still there today, secretly trying to do stuff?
Kind of hard to say, but I would say yes.
Yeah.
Still there.
So
Yeah.
would anything work?
Would anything work?
Yeah, I mean, when our involvement didn't work, or this, like you said,
It was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag.
There's a great show on
It's the same.
Netflix right now. It's called Narcos.
Narcos.
Yeah, it's all about Escobar. And everything.
Oh, yeah.
and all that influence and how he was in South America.
Yeah, in 2014, I went to Colombia and they've built a tourist industry about visit the places where Pablo Escobar frequented. So you go on a boat, they say, oh, up there, that's the disco where Pablo used to dance. It was bombed by the military. And oh, this is the summer house where Pablo used to travel to on weekends. It was bombed by the military, all of these bombed out locations in Colombia.
In 1962, when the Russians were sending their ships into Cuba and everything, I was in the Army Reserve. We were in Long Beach. For 3 days, we sat in trucks, ready to get loaded onto troop ships to go down through the Panama Canal and come and attack Cuba
Wow,
on the western side.
wow.
It was not a lot of fun.
We've got about 3 minutes left. I want to offer our Zoomers a chance to come in with any question or comment. Grant, do you have your hand up? You want to say
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, I read somewhere over the last few months that much of the foreign aid that we send to some of these countries, primarily Nicaragua, only benefits about 22 to 25 families. How much of that is accurate, or what is going on with our foreign aid?
I'm sure that's probably true. However, since since Ortega resumed his presidency, I would say since 2010, 2012, most of that US aid has evaporated. I went to a church where, my last church, where one of the people in the church, his wife, or not his wife, his daughter was a lawyer, and she was building a house in Nicaragua. And Nicaragua had hopes of becoming the next Costa Rica back in 2010, 2012. But that hope has evaporated because of other conditions that have declined in Nicaragua. The rich are getting richer. Ortega's taking care of his brothers. I mean, his family are getting rich. He squirreled away money. But I don't believe that we're still sending money to Nicaragua.
Did you see the news clip about Honduras? The
Yes.
Ex-president of Honduras. who
Yes.
was on trial and convicted, and because he
Yep.
took 50 million or billion of USA.
He was a narco trafficker.
Yeah.
The trial lasted 2 years. They extradited him to the US for the trial, and now he's looking at being sentenced for life. Honduras became a conduit for cocaine to the US. Yeah.
Any other Zoomers, questions? Go right ahead. We got to wrap up in just a minute or two. Okay, final thoughts, anybody? Questions?
Anything to add, Steve?
I'm just remembering one of the stories that we got it was 2 weeks ago. We were visiting one of the churches, in one of the Catholic churches. That a young woman came in, I say young, she was probably 45. And she told us the story of hiding in a cave with her family for almost 3 years during the Civil War.
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. They couldn't even set a fire to cook their tortillas because they were afraid that the smoke would give away their location.
Mhm.
And she lived that way for 3 years.
Yeah.
They were drinking, pond water. Yeah.
Steve is going to present in class here in a few weeks about his recent trip to Guatemala. So he'll tell us more about it. Okay, who else? Mary, did you have a comment? Quick comment?
The people, are they still strong Catholics attending church, and how is the Catholic?
Are they all Catholic?
Well, I did a presentation last year about this time on Nicaragua, and it's not the large percentage you might assume. It's was closer to 40%. There's been an evangelical resurgence, not just in Brazil, but also in Central America, as more and more people have become disenchanted with the Catholic theology and the Catholic Church. Because in many ways, they align that with, the old vestiges of power in Central America.
Interesting.
The faith is there, but it's too closely aligned with the government.
You didn't mention Panama. Is there anything new or different about how they're operating, their economy?
He didn't talk a lot about, I think he mentioned that the CIA organized the removal of Noriega because he ended up being a drug trafficker, initially supported by the CIA. They removed Noriega as the president. And I think that had to be after Carter, gave back the Panama Canal.
There was an early comment about the civilian control of the military. I think that's something we need to be aware of here.
Right.
Yeah.
Last comment. Go ahead.
Well, when we were Peace Corps volunteers in Guatemala in 65 to 67, it was a time when they gave the land, as you mentioned, to the campesinos, and they didn't really know how to work the land. And so many of our volunteers were sent down to the East Coast, South Coast, to work with the people there. But they were very leery of the volunteers because they knew the CIA had been there before, and they were thinking that our Peace Corps volunteers were CIA.
Oh, yeah. So that was part of Kennedy's, his 10-year Alliance for Progress program that he tried to.
And another piece of that, he could tell it better, but he was working on a water project with a village, and we got word that Guatemala had received some money, Alliance for Progress money.
Mhm.
And so he took his group of men into the Capitol to that office. And they said, well, sorry, we don't have any money. We had to buy trucks, and we had to take care of this office, and we had to buy furniture. And so the next time they send money, maybe you can get some.
Um,
Well, good discussion. Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Great for Latin America. Next week, Ron is going to present on the Liz Cheney book, Oath and Honor, about the January 6th events. So see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.